The revolving glass doors of Halbert and Lane turned with their usual perfected rhythm, swallowing strangers and returning employees, never pausing long enough to consider the stories they carried. On a Monday that smelled faintly of rain and printer ink, a young black woman stepped through those doors in a dress that said nothing at all. It was the kind of plain, practical dress that never appears in company photos, the kind that keeps its shape and its secrets. Her shoes were clean but unremarkable, her hair neatly gathered, her face without the armor of flashy makeup. She held a tote with careful hands, the way someone holds a quiet promise. The lobby had a sheen like a new coin. A wall-length screen streamed graphs and slogans. A security guard handed over a visitor badge without looking twice, and the receptionist's smile stuttered when the woman asked for the new hire packet. There was a slight narrowing of eyes, a small hesitation at the name, an almost imperceptible recalibration of tone. The woman saw it, the pause that people think they hide, the quick rattle of assumptions behind the eyes. She had come to expect it from buildings that wanted to look like the future and people who did not want to see all of humanity in it. The elevator ride to the 12th floor hummed with the private music of anxious thoughts. She studied the numbers and felt the weight of the day press into her shoulders. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was prepared. Prepared for the way newness makes some people nervous. Prepared for the silent calculus of worth that office culture performs without admitting it. Prepared for the way a plain dress can render a person's voice invisible until someone else names its value. Prepared, above all, to keep herself rooted in the reasons she was here. The doors opened to a corridor of framed accolades, each award shining with the careful light that companies reserve for success. At the end of the hallway sat the operations department, a maze of desks and soft partitions, a field of screens with glowing eyes. She approached the first open workstation and typed her credentials with steady hands. A few heads turned and then swiveled back. The body language of busy people who regard unannounced arrivals as disruptions rather than beginnings. An HR coordinator arrived with a smile that balanced warmth and impatience. Papers were set down with a tidy tap. Explanations followed in a practiced cadence about passwords, timesheets, workflow systems, and lunch options. The woman nodded, listened, and asked her questions carefully, noting the answers in a small notebook that looked like it had lived 10 other careful lives. The coordinator's smile brightened when she noticed the neat handwriting, then dimmed again when emails piled up on her phone. She excused herself with a promising expression and vanished into the steady current of tasks that carry office people downstream. Left alone, the woman organized her desk with deliberate calm. A family photo, small enough to disappear under a stapler, slid into the corner. In it, a mother's hand rested over a daughter's, and a father's eyes held the quiet light of someone who believes in work that matters. The photo steadied her. She adjusted the monitor height, tested the keyboard, and opened the project brief that had arrived over the weekend. The task was clear: map the choke points in the company's customer onboarding process and propose low-cost fixes within 2 weeks. It wasn't glamorous work. It was something better. It was a chance to make the river run a little cleaner for the people who had to cross it. First, she studied the numbers. Drop-off rates spiked at forms that were too long and confirmations that took too long. She found duplicate fields, outdated options, and steps that existed because no one had asked whether they still needed to exist. She saw the old habits hidden in the code the way tree rings hide winters, and she made notes about pruning. The more she looked, the more she saw. And the more she saw, the more she understood the soft harm of small inefficiencies that never had to be there. Across the aisle, 2 colleagues exchanged a glance when she asked for historic access logs. The man with the crisp shirt answered in the tone people use when they file strangers under temporary. He directed her to a shared drive that hadn't been updated in months, and then returned to a chat window where laughter flashed and vanished. The woman with the lacquered nails nodded without turning her head, the physical equivalent of a one-word email. The woman in the plain dress thanked them anyway, and found the logs herself by reading the breadcrumbs of old file names and permissions that told their own story of who had been listened to and who had been ignored. By noon, she had mapped a pattern, Tasks bounced between teams that held on to narrow job definitions like life vests, and customers waited while the baton dropped. She stared at a flowchart that looked less like a line and more like a knot. A solution began to form, not flamboyant and not expensive, just a rethreading of responsibility so that the person closest to the problem could solve it without asking 4 different departments for permission to breathe. She saved her work and left for lunch with the quiet dignity of someone who understands that eating is part of working and both are part of living. In the cafeteria, tables formed their own cities. The loudest city belonged to a team that wore matching hoodies and inside jokes like badges. Another city belonged to managers who ate with one eye on their phones. She chose a chair by the window and took out a sandwich from her tote. A notification pinged on her screen. A company-wide meeting scheduled for Wednesday morning. The subject line promised announcements about culture and growth. She read it twice and closed the laptop. On her way back, she noticed the people who keep offices alive and rarely get thanked for it. The janitor with the gentle gait pushing a cart of shining tools, the mailroom assistant balancing a stack of parcels like a tower of Christmas mornings, the receptionist steadying a nervous visitor with precise kindness. She saw herself in all of them, not because of their roles, but because of the way each person held a piece of the company's soul without anyone thinking to measure it. At her desk, she returned to the work. She penciled questions that did not accuse but invited clarity. Why does the approval step loop twice? Whose fear is this duplicate form serving? Which team is ready to own the customer's first happiness? She wrote as if she were writing to people she loved because she believed work done in that spirit traveled further. By mid-afternoon, a supervisor drifted over, curious but guarded. He skimmed her screen and made a non-committal sound that supervisors practice in the mirror. He reminded her of deadlines and deliverables and the importance of alignment. She listened with the respect owed to any person showing up to do a job, and she thanked him for the reminder with the warmth reserved for those who think their job is to warn, when in truth they are asking to be reassured. He left satisfied that he had supervised. She returned to turning a stone into a path. Whispers traveled like drafts through the cubicles. Some were simple, the harmless musings of people adjusting to a new presence. Others carried the low rumble of bias, the kind that hides in suggestions about polish and fit and whether someone belongs. She did not chase or swallow any of them. She simply let them pass through one ear and out into the air, where they belonged. The work became her anchor. With each improvement suggestion, she could almost feel a future customer breathing easier, a future colleague not having to apologize for a delay caused by no one and everyone. Just before 5, a small emergency surfaced in the team chat. A client had been stuck in the onboarding loop for 3 days and was threatening to leave. The thread filled with sentences that looked like efforts but functioned as excuses. The woman checked the logs, traced the steps, and found the form that had failed silently. She nudged the gate open and documented the fix. The client moved through. No one noticed the hands that had cleared the path. The chat quieted. The office exhaled. She saved her notes in a file with a modest name and closed her laptop as if tucking in a child. Outside, the city had turned its lights on. The lobby smelled faintly of rain again. She paused by the revolving doors and watched a reflection of herself move through glass. In that reflection, she saw not just the plain dress, but the person inside it. The daughter of a mother who taught her that dignity is a daily practice. The daughter of a father who believed that power is only useful if it lifts. The woman who had come here to learn from the bottom because the bottom teaches what the top forgets. She felt tired, but it was the ordinary fatigue of honest work, the kind that sleep knows how to forgive. On the subway, she sat with her tote clutched to her lap and let the rhythm of the carriage tap out a soothing code. She thought of the meeting scheduled for Wednesday and the words in the subject line that promised growth. She thought of the faces she had seen, the quick glances that measured and decided, the few open ones that might turn into allies. She thought of the first customer she had helped without ever speaking to them, and she allowed herself a small, private satisfaction, the kind that does not need witnesses. At home, she placed her notebook on the kitchen table. A plant in the window had leaned obediently toward the sun. She watered it and imagined the office as a field of such plants, each one bending toward whatever light it was given. She hoped to open a few blinds. She hoped to coax a few into the sun. She warmed leftovers, washed her dish, and stood in the quiet home that her labor maintained. In that quiet, she promised herself to remain kind, to remain grounded, to remain gentle with her judgments and fierce with her standards. She promised to let the whispering be the wind and the work be the music. Night gathered like a soft coat. She slept without dreams and woke before the alarm, the way people do when they are carrying more than their own future. She returned to the building with the revolving doors and stepped into the lobby as if stepping into water she already knew how to swim. The receptionist recognized her now and waved her through. Upstairs, she found an email in her inbox that asked for her input on the onboarding map she had quietly drafted, sent by a manager whose name did not appear in the original thread. The door had cracked open a fraction, just enough for light to find her. She took a breath, opened her notebook, and began. The plain dress said nothing. Her work began to speak. And as the clock moved toward Wednesday's company-wide meeting, the floor of Halbert and Lane shifted barely, almost invisibly, the way the ground sometimes does before a storm that cleans more than it destroys. The days leading up to the company-wide meeting unfolded like pages in a book that many had read before, but few had understood. The woman in the plain dress arrived each morning with the same calm posture, carrying the same tote, wearing the same quiet expression that revealed nothing and saw everything. Her presence settled into the office like a soft thread, subtle yet impossible to untie once woven. Still, the whispers continued. Some were shaped by curiosity, others by the need to categorize what they did not yet understand. A few admired her discipline silently, though they would not say so aloud for fear of being noticed admiring the wrong person. The office was full of small performances, each person adjusting themselves depending on who was watching. For them, the world was a mirror. For her, the world was a window. She continued her project with unwavering intention. Each morning, she reviewed new logs. Each afternoon, she refined the workflow map. She found ways to eliminate delays, simplify approvals, shorten waits. She typed solutions with hands that seemed to move by memory, shaped by years of absorbing efficiency not from textbooks, but from life itself. Household routines, community responsibilities, problem-solving learned out of necessity, not theory. Meanwhile, her coworkers' perception of her settled into a comfortable misunderstanding. They believed she was competent enough to be useful, but not remarkable enough to require notice. She existed in the middle space, the place where most dignity is overlooked. Yet, something subtle began to shift. The supervisor, who had once spoken to her as though her work required guarding, now found himself beginning to seek her updates first thing every morning. He did not acknowledge the change. He simply gravitated toward clarity, and clarity lived in her work. The woman with lacquered nails observed the newcomer's focus in moments when she believed no one was watching. She noticed the discipline in the newcomer's posture, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she did not rush to fill silence with justification or nervous laughter. She watched, too, the way some employees performed confidence when the CEO passed through the floor, standing straighter and adjusting their voices like actors preparing for a scene. She noticed that the woman in the plain dress did not shift at all. She remained exactly herself, and that unsettled something deep within her. The man with the crisp shirts, who had once given dismissive half-answers, noticed that the newcomer's suggestions were quietly being referenced in team discussions. Her name did not accompany the ideas, not yet, but her work had begun to move through the company like water slipping through unseen channels. Still, no one knew. No one knew how she had grown up in conference rooms, sitting in the corners while her father discussed mergers and leadership strategies. No. One knew how she had watched employees change how they spoke depending on who they believed held power. No one knew how many times she had seen a person's humanity disappear behind someone else's. Assumptions. No one knew she already understood. This building, deeper than any of them, Wednesday, arrived like a held breath. Meeting room was a polished amphitheater of modern corporate ambition. Rows of chairs curved toward a presentation screen that displayed the company logo in confident blues and golds. Employees filed in, some with excitement, others with calculation, a few with dread at the possibility of change. The woman in the plain dress chose a seat near the side wall. Not in the back to disappear, not in the front to be noticed. A place where she could observe without obstruction. A place where she could see all the shifting expressions that would soon reveal themselves. The CEO entered with the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to dominance, but not the kind carried by arrogance. His leadership was not loud. It was grounded, steady, measured. His eyes moved across the room not looking for applause, but for attention, the kind of attention that comes from belief. A few employees straightened immediately, their voices lifting in friendly greetings that felt like extensions of invisible scripts. The supervisor adopted a posture of prepared alignment. The woman with lacquered nails crossed her arms with quiet anticipation. The man with the crisp shirts checked that his notes were visible on his tablet, in case the moment offered a chance to impress. The CEO smiled, but his eyes held something deeper. Something quiet and observant. Something protective. He began to speak about growth, not in profits, but in people. He spoke of culture, not as a poster on the wall, but as a daily behavior. He spoke of teamwork, not as a slogan, but as an ethic. His voice did not rise. It guided. The employees listened, some nodding because they agreed, others nodding because they wished to appear aligned. And then the CEO paused, the air tightening just slightly, the room sensing a pivot. He spoke of learning how people are treated, not when they are impressive, but when they are ordinary. He spoke of the power of humility, not as a gesture, but as a path. He spoke of leadership, not from the top of the building, but from the floor where the work actually happened. Some looked confused, some intrigued, some uneasy, and then he gestured. The room followed the gesture. To her. The woman in the plain dress sat still, her hands resting in her lap, her breath controlled but not rigid. She did not move to adjust her clothing or her posture. She simply existed, fully present. The CEO said her name with a tone that folded pride into recognition. He said she was not just a new employee. He said she had chosen to begin here, not by necessity, but by purpose. He said she was his daughter, his successor in training, not to inherit power, but to understand the weight of it. The room changed shape. Some faces froze in disbelief, some flushed red with shame, some widened with a dawning respect that arrived too late to be clean. The supervisor's mouth opened a fraction, then closed again. The woman with lacquered nails lowered her gaze, her well-rehearsed poise cracking at the edges. The man with the crisp shirt looked away, realizing the type of mirror now placed in front of him, and the woman in the plain dress did not look at any of them to savor the moment. She simply nodded. Her expression soft, composed, and deeply human, not triumphant, not vindictive, only steady. The room absorbed a silence that was not empty, but full of consequences. This was the moment when masks began to loosen. And in that silence, something old inside the company shifted, quietly, but permanently. The air in the meeting room did not settle immediately. It hovered, held between shock and dawning comprehension, as though the walls themselves needed a moment to absorb what had been revealed. Faces that had once moved with certainty now slowed, recalibrating the meanings of every past interaction, every overlooked gesture, every small dismissal. The woman in the plain dress sat with her hands steady in her lap, as she had throughout the meeting, but the space around her felt transformed, not by her posture, but by the truth that now surrounded it. When the announcement concluded, the employees dispersed in small clusters, their movements uncertain. Some whispered behind carefully angled shoulders. Others walked away in silence, their thoughts too tangled to articulate. The supervisor lingered longer than most, his expression troubled not by anger or embarrassment, but by recognition. He walked away without approaching her, yet his steps held a heaviness that suggested an internal reckoning had already begun. The woman rose, not hurriedly, not triumphantly, but with the same unassuming grace with which she had arrived on her first day. She left the meeting room and returned to the 12th floor. The walk back felt different, not because of how she felt about herself, but because of the way people now shifted around her. Some looked up from their screens with eyes that sought forgiveness. Others avoided her entirely, afraid of what their previous actions might now reflect about them. At her desk, the light from the window fell across her workstation the same way it always had. She opened her notebook and resumed reviewing the process maps, as though the world had not changed in the last hour. In truth, she understood something important. Change that comes from revelation is not yet transformation. People do not become better simply because they have been exposed. Growth requires time, discomfort, reflection, and quiet work. The afternoon progressed slowly. The man with the crisp shirts approached her desk first, his usual confidence now replaced by a careful hesitation. He asked a question about the onboarding metrics, though he had likely already known the answer. She replied, calm, direct, without resentment. He nodded too many times, thanked her with a formality that felt slightly brittle, and walked away with shoulders that suggested relief and regret in equal measure. Next came the woman with lacquered nails. Her approach was slower and her posture less certain than it had been days before. She did not speak. She simply placed a folder on the desk that had been missing from the shared drive, the one that contained the most accurate historical workflow data. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not apology, but acknowledgement. The lacquered nails woman returned to her desk without fanfare, though her movements were quieter now, as though she had learned something about herself that would take time to fully understand. The supervisor did not approach her until the end of the day. His voice remained steady, but something in it had softened. He assigned her next steps for the project, not out of obligation or formality, but because he now recognized the depth of thought she brought to the work. He did not attempt to compensate for past condescension. Instead, he allowed the moment to be simple, two people working together toward clarity. It was the start of something real, though fragile, but not everyone changed. Not everyone wants to see what truth reveals about them. Some whispered that she must have been given her role, not earned it. Others resented the idea that humility could be strategic, that her plain dress might have been a test. They did not realize that she had always dressed like that, not to observe others, but because her sense of self had never been tied to display or validation. The days that followed were days of quiet tension. The company did not openly restructure itself. No sweeping announcements were made. No new slogans were printed. Instead, the work itself began to shift in subtle ways. Meetings became more listening-oriented. Suggestions that once went ignored were now considered. The culture did not transform overnight, but a stillness had settled, a stillness that made people aware of the space where respect should have existed all along. The woman continued her project. She drafted a new onboarding pathway that reduced wait times by nearly half. She outlined a cross-team communication system that allowed employees to resolve customer issues without bureaucratic approval loops. Her recommendations were grounded in practicality and empathy, the understanding that efficiency serves not just profit, but dignity. When she submitted the proposal to leadership, the CEO reviewed it privately in his office. He traced his finger over the diagrams, seeing in them not only process improvements, but reflections of the very lessons he had spent years trying to instill in those who would lead after him. He saw patience, precision, and a commitment to clarity without spectacle. He felt something warm rise in him, not pride rooted in ownership or legacy, but pride in witnessing someone choose to be good when they could easily have chosen to be powerful instead. Yet, even with progress, the woman felt the weight of others' eyes. Some eyes were newly respectful, others newly resentful. The burden of being known was often heavier than the burden of being underestimated. She reminded herself that she was here to learn, not to be celebrated, not to correct others, not to prove anything. She would move at her pace, in her way. Late one evening, when most of the office had emptied, she stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline pulsed with artificial light, but beneath it the quiet life of the city moved gently. She thought of her father's lessons, that leadership is service, that power is responsibility, that humility is not what you show others. It is how you carry yourself when no one applauds. She rested her palm against the cool glass and allowed herself a small breath of weariness. Not defeat, but human fatigue. Growth was unfolding around her, but growth is slow. It requires daily tending. It requires, above all, patience. Below her, the city continued breathing. Above her, another day waited. The next step in her journey would not be about being recognized. It would be about what she would do now that everyone was watching. The morning after the citywide meeting felt different. Though nothing visible had changed, the floors of the office were still polished, the hallways still echoed with the muted hum of printers, the coffee machine still released its familiar hiss and sigh. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, something subtle had shifted. An awareness, a watchfulness, a recognition that the presence of the woman in the plain dress now carried meaning. Not the meaning assigned by wealth or title, but the kind that grows from truth, from patience, from being seen clearly. She arrived at her desk at the same time she always had. She removed her notebook from her tote, placed it beside her keyboard, and reviewed her plans for the day. There were no dramatic changes awaiting her, no sudden elevation in her duties. Her responsibilities remained the same: refine the onboarding process, work with cross-department representatives, prepare the next stage of implementation. She welcomed this continuity. She had come here to learn, not to leap. Yet others approached her differently now. The supervisor no longer spoke to her with the carefully calibrated authority of one who assumes superiority. Instead, his tone carried a measured respect, still professional, still reserved, but anchored now in acknowledgement rather than assumption. His questions were thoughtful, his requests collaborative. He seemed to understand that leadership is not weakened when shared. It is strengthened. The man with the crisp shirts no longer strutted through conversations. His voice had softened, his shoulders lowered. He asked questions now, not to test, not to compete, but to understand. Something in him was rearranging itself. Whether it would hold was yet to be known. The woman with lacquered nails was perhaps the most changed. There was no show in her transformation, no exaggerated smiles or forced friendliness. Instead, she listened more. She paused before speaking. She watched her own reactions with new awareness. Once she would have reacted defensively when challenged, eager to protect her place. Now she allowed herself the discomfort of reflection. Growth, she was learning, is not elegant, but it is honest. Still, others resisted. Some employees avoided the woman in the plain dress entirely, not out of anger, but out of fear that proximity to her would reveal their own flaws. Others maintained polite distance, their pride not yet softened enough to admit that they had misjudged someone simply because she did not arrive wrapped in the language of status. The woman did not push. She did not correct. She did not try to persuade or teach. She simply lived her truth quietly, believing that example is a more enduring form of guidance than instruction. She allowed people to come to their realizations in their own time. Weeks passed. The onboarding improvements she designed were implemented one by one. Where once customers had waited days for responses, they now received clarity within hours. Tasks that had once required 3 departments now required only 1. The way work flowed through the company began to shift, from tangled and defensive to efficient and collaborative. It was not magic. It was intention, and intention is a slow builder of worlds. Her work began to reach the CEO's desk not through family channels, not through whispered influence, but through the same channels that carried all other contributions. Her proposals stood on their own merit, requiring no introduction. Her name became associated not with her lineage, but with her clarity. One afternoon, the CEO invited her to his office, not for praise, not for recognition, but for conversation. They spoke not as father and daughter, not as CEO and employee, but as two people connected by a shared purpose. They discussed the company's deeper culture, the silent habits of hierarchy, the hidden assumptions that shaped interactions, the old patterns that had quietly distorted the way dignity was distributed. They both understood something crucial. Improving systems was the easy part. Shifting hearts required patience and steady presence, and presence the woman carried in abundance. Over the following months, her role expanded, not with fanfare, not with announcements, but with trust. Teams began to request her involvement in projects. Her voice began to guide discussions, not because she demanded space, but because she brought clarity where confusion had lived for too long. Her suggestions were not loud, but they reshaped outcomes. And through it all, she kept wearing plain, simple clothes. Not as symbolism, not as test, not as statement, because that was who she was. Someone who did not need to be adorned to be worthy. Someone whose value did not depend on display. Someone raised to understand that confidence can be silent. Her coworkers learned slowly. Some learned eagerly, some reluctantly, some not at all. But the culture shifted degree by degree, like the turning of a tide no one can see happening until the shoreline is already different. The woman in the plain dress never sought to be admired. She sought only to be true. The office learned to watch people more carefully, not for their polish, but for their substance. They learned to listen before deciding. They learned that respect is not something granted based on appearance, but something owed to every person as a starting point, not a reward. One morning, months later, as the company flourished quietly under new rhythms of collaboration, a new employee entered the building. She was young, nervous, uncertain. Her clothing was plain, her voice soft, her presence small. The receptionist smiled at her warmly. A colleague showed her where to sit without judgment. The supervisor introduced himself with sincerity, not authority. No whispers, no measuring glances, no quiet dismissals hidden behind polite smiles. The new employee sat at her desk, and the woman, in the plain dress, approached her, not as a leader looking down, nor as someone issuing guidance from a distance, but as a person extending care. She offered help with the onboarding system she had redesigned. She made space. She offered welcome. The cycle of dignity continued, not because of power, but because of choice, because a single person had once stepped into a room wearing plain clothes and chosen to remain entirely and unapologetically herself, because character, when held steadily, becomes legacy, because kindness, when practiced consistently, becomes culture, and because leadership is not a role, leadership is a way of being. The end.